"You're just a cleaning lady. Don't touch my briefcase." Richard Sterling's voice cut through the luxurious silence of the Las Vegas International Hotel penthouse suite like a slap across the face. The words were delivered with such contempt, such casual cruelty that they seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. Dorothy Williams, 58 years old and dressed in the standard gray uniform of hotel housekeeping staff, had been carefully dusting around Sterling's expensive leather briefcase when his explosive outburst stopped her cold. Dorothy's hand trembled slightly as she pulled it back from the polished mahogany table where Sterling had spread his important business documents. She had been working as carefully as always, using the gentle, precise movements that had once guided her hand across chalkboards when she taught Shakespeare and Dickens to eager high school students. That was before her husband Robert's cancer diagnosis. Before the medical bills that consumed their savings, their retirement fund, and eventually their middle-class dignity. What Richard Sterling didn't know, what none of the hotel guests ever bothered to learn, was that the woman he was treating like an inconvenient piece of furniture had once been Dorothy Williams, Patterson, Tennessee Teacher of the Year 1987. She had spent 15 years inspiring teenagers to discover the beauty of literature, helping them understand that words had power to change hearts and minds and entire worldviews. She had stood before packed auditoriums during graduation ceremonies, watching former students receive college scholarships that she had helped them earn through countless hours of patient tutoring and encouragement. She had framed letters from students who wrote to thank her for believing in them when no one else would, for seeing potential where others saw only problems. But that life belonged to someone else now. That life had ended on a Tuesday morning in March 2003, when Dr. Harrison had delivered Robert's diagnosis with the kind of clinical detachment that doctors use to protect themselves from the weight of delivering devastating news. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe 12 with aggressive treatment. The treatments had extended Robert's life by 14 months, precious time that Dorothy would never regret purchasing with every dollar they had saved over 23 years of marriage. But the cost had been everything: their house, their car, their comfortable middle-class existence, and eventually Dorothy's career, as she had been forced to take increasingly flexible jobs that would allow her to care for Robert during his final months. When Robert passed away in May 2005, Dorothy had found herself completely alone for the first time in her adult life, with no savings, no home, and no way to return to teaching without additional certification that she couldn't afford. At 58, she had discovered that starting over meant accepting whatever work she could find, and hotel housekeeping at the Las Vegas International Hotel paid better than most service jobs available to women her age. For 2 years she had cleaned rooms, changed sheets, scrubbed bathrooms, and maintained the kind of invisible presence that wealthy hotel guests preferred from service staff. She had learned to move quietly, speak softly when spoken to, and above all, never to remind guests that housekeeping staff were human beings with histories, dreams, and dignity that deserved basic respect. Most guests ignored her completely, which Dorothy actually preferred. Invisible was better than the alternative, which was what she was experiencing now with Richard Sterling, a real estate mogul from Chicago who had been staying in the hotel's most expensive suite for the past week, while conducting business meetings that apparently required him to spread confidential documents across every available surface. Sterling was the kind of man who measured his worth by his ability to make other people feel small. At 52, he had built a commercial real estate empire through a combination of aggressive business tactics and an absolute refusal to acknowledge the humanity of anyone he considered beneath his social and economic status. His treatment of hotel staff had been consistently awful since his arrival. He spoke to waiters like they were servants in some feudal manner, demanded that housekeeping rearrange their entire schedule to accommodate his unpredictable habits, and had actually complained to management about having to share elevator space with the help during his trips between floors. The hotel staff had learned to avoid Sterling whenever possible, but Dorothy's job required her to clean his suite daily, a task that had become increasingly unpleasant as Sterling seemed to take sadistic pleasure in treating her with escalating disrespect. This morning had started like all the others, with Dorothy arriving at Sterling's suite at precisely 8 a.m. as scheduled, carrying her cart of cleaning supplies and fresh linens. She had knocked softly and announced her presence as hotel protocol required, then entered when Sterling impatiently waved her in without looking up from his newspaper. For the first 30 minutes, Sterling had ignored her completely while she worked around him, cleaning the bathroom, making the bed, and dusting furniture with the quiet efficiency that 2 years of hotel housekeeping had perfected. Dorothy had learned to work around even the most difficult guests without disrupting their activities or drawing unwanted attention to herself. But when she had begun dusting the main sitting area where Sterling had set up his mobile office, he had suddenly become aware of her presence in a way that filled the room with hostile energy. Every movement she made seemed to irritate him. Every small sound from her cleaning activities prompted an annoyed glance or an exasperated sigh. When Dorothy had begun carefully dusting around his briefcase, using the same gentle precision she had always employed when handling other people's possessions, Sterling had finally exploded with the kind of rage that revealed the ugly core of his character. "You're just a cleaning lady, don't touch my briefcase." The words hit Dorothy with the force of a physical blow, not because they were particularly creative insults, but because of the casual contempt behind them. Sterling wasn't even angry in the way that suggested he saw Dorothy as a human being worthy of anger. He was annoyed in the way someone might be annoyed by a dog that had wandered too close to something valuable. Dorothy had encountered difficult people before, both in her teaching career and during her 2 years at the hotel, but Sterling's dismissal carried a particularly stinging quality that reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she had been forced to give up, and everything she might never recover. "I apologize, sir," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of dignified composure that had once commanded respect from roomfuls of teenagers. "I was simply trying to clean around your materials without disturbing them." "I don't care what you were trying to do," Sterling snapped, not even looking up from his documents. "Just stay away from my things, do your cleaning and get out. I have important work to do." The dismissal was complete and brutal. Dorothy was not a person to Sterling. She was a function, an inconvenience, a barely tolerable interruption to his important day. She was exactly what he had called her, just a cleaning lady, with the word just carrying all the weight of social hierarchy and economic contempt that such language could bear. What neither Dorothy nor Sterling knew was that their entire interaction had been overheard by someone whose presence in the hotel would transform the meaning and consequences of Sterling's casual cruelty. Elvis Presley had been walking down the hallway toward his own suite when Sterling's voice had carried through the partially open door. Elvis was staying at the hotel during his regular Las Vegas engagement, and he had developed the habit of taking quiet walks through the hotel's corridors during the early morning hours when most guests were still sleeping and the hallways offered a rare opportunity for privacy and reflection. Elvis had paused outside Sterling's door not because he intended to eavesdrop, but because the tone of Sterling's voice had been so aggressively hostile that it had cut through Elvis's morning contemplation like an alarm bell. In his experience, that level of anger usually indicated serious trouble, and Elvis's natural instinct was to assess whether someone might need help. When he heard Sterling's words, "You're just a cleaning lady," Elvis felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he had felt as a child when people looked down on his family because they were poor, because they lived in government housing, because they didn't fit other people's narrow definitions of respectability and worth. Elvis understood what it meant to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human because of circumstances beyond your control. He had grown up in a world where poverty was treated as a moral failing, where being poor meant being judged as lazy, stupid, or somehow deserving of contempt from people who had been born into better circumstances. But this was different. This wasn't about poverty or social class in the abstract. This was about a specific human being who was being humiliated by someone who clearly believed that economic status gave him the right to treat other people as objects rather than individuals deserving of basic dignity and respect. Elvis had seen enough of Sterling's behavior over the past week to recognize the pattern. Sterling treated service staff like they were invisible when he needed something from them and like nuisances when they were simply trying to do their jobs. He was the kind of person who believed that paying for services gave him the right to purchase human dignity along with housekeeping and room service. As Elvis stood in the hallway listening to the aftermath of Sterling's outburst, he made a decision that would transform both Dorothy's and Sterling's understanding of what respect really meant and how it should be extended between human beings regardless of their economic circumstances or social positions. Elvis knocked softly on the doorframe and stepped into the suite, his presence immediately changing the entire energy of the room. He was wearing casual clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but there was no mistaking who he was or the kind of attention his presence commanded. "Good morning," Elvis said pleasantly, directing his greeting to both Sterling and Dorothy with the kind of inclusive courtesy that immediately established his respect for both people as equally worthy of polite acknowledgement. Sterling looked up from his documents with obvious surprise and sudden nervousness. Having Elvis Presley unexpectedly appear in his hotel suite was the kind of celebrity encounter that would normally have thrilled him, but something about Elvis's demeanor suggested that this wasn't going to be the kind of casual, starstruck interaction that Sterling might have anticipated. Dorothy, meanwhile, had frozen in place beside her cleaning cart, uncertain whether she should continue working, excuse herself, or wait for direction from either of the two men who were now the primary occupants of the space she had been hired to clean. "Presley," Sterling said, standing up from his chair and extending his hand with the kind of false enthusiasm that people use when they're trying to appear more important than they are. "What an unexpected pleasure. I'm Richard Sterling. Sterling Commercial Properties. I've been following your career for years." Elvis accepted the handshake but didn't return Sterling's artificial warmth. Instead, he turned his attention to Dorothy, who was still standing quietly beside her cleaning supplies, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and uncertain about her role in whatever was about to unfold. "I don't believe we've met," Elvis said to Dorothy, extending his hand with genuine courtesy. "I'm Elvis Presley, and I'm pleased to meet you." Dorothy looked surprised by the introduction, as if she hadn't expected to be acknowledged as a person worthy of formal introduction in the presence of two obviously important men. She hesitated for just a moment, then accepted Elvis's handshake with the kind of natural grace that spoke to her educational background and inherent dignity. "Dorothy Williams," she replied softly. "I'm part of the housekeeping staff here at the hotel." "Dorothy Williams," Elvis repeated thoughtfully, as if he were committing the name to memory because it was important to remember the names of people you meet. "That's a beautiful name. How long have you been working here at the hotel, Dorothy?" The question was simple, but it carried weight because it treated Dorothy as a person with a history and a story rather than just a function to be performed and dismissed. Sterling watched this interaction with growing discomfort, sensing that Elvis's attention to the hotel housekeeper was somehow connected to his own behavior, though he couldn't yet understand how or why. 2 years, Dorothy answered, still somewhat tentatively, because she wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention in situations like this, especially positive attention that treated her as worthy of interest and conversation. 2 years, Elvis nodded. That's a significant commitment. The hotel is lucky to have someone who takes such obvious care with her work. Elvis gestured toward Dorothy's cleaning cart, which was organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that reflected professional pride and personal standards that went far beyond the minimum requirements of her job. "I noticed how carefully you were working when I passed by earlier," Elvis continued. "The way you handle other people's belongings with such respect, even when they're not your own. That speaks to character." Sterling was beginning to understand that Elvis had indeed witnessed his earlier interaction with Dorothy, and that this conversation was not happening by coincidence. The realization made him increasingly nervous because he could sense Elvis's disapproval even though it hadn't been explicitly stated. "Mr. Presley," Sterling interrupted, trying to redirect the conversation toward safer ground. "I hope you'll forgive the disruption. I was just trying to get some work done, and you know how it is with staff sometimes. Elvis turned his attention back to Sterling, and the change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warmth that had been present when he spoke to Dorothy was replaced by something cooler and more evaluative. "Actually, I'm not sure I do know how it is with staff," Elvis replied calmly. "Why don't you explain it to me?" The question put Sterling in an impossible position. He couldn't explain his behavior without revealing the contemptuous attitude that had motivated it, but he also couldn't pretend that nothing had happened when Elvis had clearly overheard at least part of the interaction. "Well, you know," Sterling said awkwardly, "sometimes you need to be firm with service people to make sure they understand boundaries and expectations." "Firm," Elvis repeated, as if he were testing the word to see how it felt. "Is that what you call it?" Dorothy stood silently during this exchange, but she was beginning to understand that Elvis was challenging Sterling's behavior in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. She had never seen anyone with Sterling's obvious wealth and social status held accountable for treating service workers badly, and she found herself both grateful and nervous about where this confrontation might lead. "I'm curious about something, Mr. Sterling," Elvis continued, his voice remaining pleasant even as his words became more pointed. "What do you think gives one person the right to treat another person as if they're worth less than basic courtesy and respect?" Sterling's face flushed slightly because the question forced him to confront the assumptions that underlied his behavior. He had never been asked to justify his treatment of service staff because in his social and business circles, such treatment was considered normal and acceptable. "I don't think I understand what you're getting at," Sterling replied, though his tone suggested that he understood perfectly and was hoping to avoid having to defend his position explicitly. "Let me be more specific," Elvis said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't going to accept evasion. "I heard you tell Mrs. Williams that she was just a cleaning lady, and that she shouldn't touch your belongings. I'm wondering what you meant by that phrase, just a cleaning lady." The directness of the question left Sterling with no room for maneuvering. Elvis had clearly heard the exchange, and he was demanding an explanation that Sterling couldn't provide without revealing the ugly assumptions about human worth that motivated his behavior. "I think there might have been a misunderstanding," Sterling said weakly. "I was just trying to protect some sensitive business documents." "By calling someone just a cleaning lady?" Elvis asked. "I'm still not clear on how that phrase relates to protecting documents. It sounds more like you were expressing an opinion about Mrs. Williams' worth as a human being." Dorothy felt her heart racing as she listened to Elvis systematically dismantling Sterling's attempts to avoid accountability for his behavior. She had never experienced anyone with Elvis's status and influence standing up for a service worker against a wealthy guest, and she wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or terrified about the potential consequences. Sterling realized that his attempts at evasion were failing and that Elvis was determined to force him to confront his behavior directly. The realization made him defensive in a way that revealed even more about his character than his original treatment of Dorothy had shown. "Look, Mr. Presley," Sterling said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I pay good money to stay in this hotel, and I expect to be able to work without interference from staff members who don't understand appropriate boundaries." "Appropriate boundaries," Elvis repeated thoughtfully. "Let me ask you something else, Mr. Sterling. What do you know about Mrs. Williams' background?" The question caught both Sterling and Dorothy off guard. Sterling because he had never considered that Dorothy might have a background beyond her current job, and Dorothy because she couldn't imagine why Elvis would be interested in her personal history. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," Sterling replied impatiently. "Humor me," Elvis said simply. Sterling looked frustrated by the direction of the conversation, but he was beginning to realize that Elvis wasn't going to drop the subject until he received satisfactory answers to his questions. "I assume she's a hotel employee who cleans rooms," Sterling said dismissively. "Beyond that, I don't see why her background would be relevant to my need to maintain security around confidential business materials." Elvis turned back to Dorothy, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement at Elvis's persistence in defending her dignity against Sterling's continued dismissal. "Mrs. Williams," Elvis said gently. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your background with Mr. Sterling? I think he might benefit from understanding who you really are." Dorothy hesitated, not because she was ashamed of her past, but because she had learned over the past 2 years that most hotel guests weren't interested in learning about the personal histories of service staff. She had also learned that sharing too much personal information could sometimes make her job more complicated rather than easier. But Elvis was asking with genuine interest and obvious respect for her as a person, and Dorothy found herself wanting to respond to that respect with honesty about who she had been before circumstances forced her into her current position. "I was a high school English teacher for 15 years, Dorothy said quietly, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "I taught literature and writing at Franklin County High School in Tennessee. I was named Teacher of the Year in 1987. The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. He had been operating under the assumption that Dorothy was exactly what he had called her, just a cleaning lady with no education, no professional background, and no legitimate claim to respect beyond the basic courtesy that any human being deserved. Learning that she had been a respected educator, someone who had spent 15 years shaping young minds and inspiring students to achieve their potential, completely undermined his assumptions about her worth and his justification for treating her with contempt. "A teacher," Elvis said, nodding with obvious respect. "That's one of the most important professions in the world. Teachers shape the future by investing in young people's minds and hearts." "What subjects did you teach, Mrs. Williams?" "English literature and composition," Dorothy replied, warming to the subject despite the awkward circumstances. "Shakespeare, Dickens, American poets, essay writing. I loved helping students discover that reading and writing could change their lives." "Shakespeare," Elvis said with genuine interest. "I've always been fascinated by Shakespeare's ability to write about human nature in ways that still feel relevant centuries later. What was your favorite play to teach?" The question opened a door that Dorothy had kept closed for 2 years. Teaching literature had been more than just a job for her. It had been a calling, a way of sharing the transformative power of great writing with young people who might never have discovered it otherwise. "Hamlet," Dorothy said, her face lighting up with enthusiasm that had been dormant for too long. Students always connected with Hamlet's struggle to understand his place in a world that seemed corrupt and hostile. They saw themselves in his questions about identity and purpose and moral responsibility. Sterling watched this exchange with growing discomfort. He was beginning to understand that his treatment of Dorothy hadn't just been rude, it had been ignorant and cruel in ways that reflected poorly on his own character and intelligence. Elvis continued the conversation with obvious, genuine interest in Dorothy's educational philosophy and teaching experience, asking questions that demonstrated respect for her professional expertise and personal insights. "What made you decide to become a teacher?" Elvis asked. "I believed that literature could change lives," Dorothy replied, her voice growing stronger as she talked about something that had been central to her identity for most of her adult life. "I had teachers who showed me that reading great books could help me understand myself and the world better. I wanted to pass that gift on to the next generation." "And did you succeed?" Elvis asked. "Did you change lives?" Dorothy smiled, and for the first time since Sterling's outburst she looked genuinely happy. "I received letters from former students for years after they graduated. Some went to college on scholarships. Others discovered careers they never would have considered. A few became teachers themselves." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Elvis nodded with obvious appreciation for what she had accomplished during her teaching career. "That's an incredible legacy," Elvis said sincerely. "Those students carry your influence with them wherever they go. That kind of impact lasts for generations." Sterling, meanwhile, was struggling with the growing realization that he had treated a distinguished educator with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who had never contributed anything positive to society. The contrast between Dorothy's actual background and his assumptions about her worth was forcing him to confront ugly truths about his own character and value system. "Mrs. Williams," Elvis continued, "if you don't mind me asking, what brought you from teaching to hotel housekeeping? That's quite a career change." The question touched on painful territory, but Dorothy had come too far in this conversation to retreat into the protective silence she had maintained for 2 years. "My husband Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003, she said quietly. "The treatments extended his life for 14 months, but they cost everything we had saved over 23 years of marriage. After he passed away, I found myself starting over at 58 with no savings and no way to return to teaching without additional certification I couldn't afford." The explanation hung in the air like an indictment of everything Sterling had assumed about Dorothy's situation. She wasn't working at the hotel because she lacked education or ambition or professional skills. She was working there because life had dealt her a series of devastating blows that had forced her to rebuild her existence from nothing. Elvis felt a deep admiration for Dorothy's strength and resilience, and a growing anger at Sterling's ignorant assumptions about the circumstances that had brought her to her current position. "I'm sorry for your loss," Elvis said gently. "Your husband was lucky to have someone willing to sacrifice everything for his care, and the students you taught were lucky to have a teacher who understood that education is about more than just facts and figures." Dorothy felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, not because she was sad, but because Elvis's acknowledgement of her sacrifice and her professional contributions was the first recognition she had received in 2 years that her life had meaning and value beyond her ability to clean hotel rooms efficiently. Sterling stood silent during this exchange, overwhelmed by the realization that his contemptuous treatment of Dorothy had been based on complete ignorance of who she was and what she had experienced. He was beginning to understand that Elvis's questions had been designed to expose not just his rudeness but his fundamental failure to see Dorothy as a complex human being deserving of respect. "Mr. Sterling," Elvis said, turning his attention back to the businessman with a directness that made Sterling visibly uncomfortable. "Now that you know a little bit more about Mrs. Williams's background, I'm wondering if you'd like to reconsider your earlier comment about her being just a cleaning lady." The question forced Sterling to confront the choice between defending his indefensible behavior or acknowledging that he had been wrong in ways that revealed serious character flaws. He looked at Dorothy, who was standing quietly beside her cleaning cart, maintaining the kind of dignified composure that reflected the strength and grace she had developed over a lifetime of facing challenges with integrity. "I think I may have spoken hastily," Sterling said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with having to acknowledge his mistake in front of both Dorothy and Elvis. "Hastily?" Elvis repeated, his tone suggesting that he found Sterling's choice of words inadequate. "Is that really what you think happened here?" Sterling realized that Elvis wasn't going to accept a half-hearted apology or a minimization of what had occurred. He was being held accountable for his behavior in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary. "I was wrong," Sterling said more directly, looking at Dorothy rather than at Elvis. "I made assumptions about you that were unfair and disrespectful. I apologize." Dorothy accepted the apology with a gracious nod, but Elvis wasn't finished with the conversation. "I appreciate that you're willing to apologize, Mr. Sterling," Elvis said. "But I'm curious about something else. This morning's interaction with Mrs. Williams didn't happen in isolation. You've been staying at this hotel for a week, and I've observed how you treat service staff. What I saw this morning seems to be part of a pattern." Sterling's face flushed again because Elvis was right. His treatment of Dorothy had been consistent with his treatment of waiters, bellhops, housekeepers, and other hotel employees throughout his stay. "I think perhaps I've been under a lot of business stress," Sterling said, grasping for an explanation that might excuse his broader pattern of behavior. "Stress," Elvis said thoughtfully. "Do you think Mrs. Williams might have experienced any stress over the past few years? Watching her husband die of cancer, losing her career, having to rebuild her life from nothing in her late 50s. The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the selfishness and self-pity underlying Sterling's attempt to excuse his behavior. Whatever stress Sterling was experiencing from his business dealings paled in comparison to the genuine hardships Dorothy had faced with dignity and grace. "You're right," Sterling said, his voice becoming quieter as the full weight of Elvis's criticism began to sink in. "There's no excuse for how I've been behaving. Elvis nodded approvingly at Sterling's more honest acknowledgement of his mistakes, but he still wasn't finished with the lesson he was determined to teach. "Mr. Sterling," Elvis said, "I want you to understand something important. Every person who works in this hotel, every housekeeper, every waiter, every person who serves you in any capacity, has a story as complex and valuable as yours. They have families they're supporting, dreams they're pursuing, challenges they're facing with courage and dignity." He gestured toward Dorothy, who was listening to this exchange with amazement at Elvis's passionate defense of service workers' humanity and worth. Mrs. Williams spent 15 years inspiring young people to love learning and to believe in their own potential. She sacrificed everything she had to care for the person she loved most. She's rebuilding her life at an age when most people are thinking about retirement, and she's doing it with grace and professionalism. Elvis's voice gained intensity as he continued. "When you treat someone like Mrs. Williams as if she's just a cleaning lady, you're not just being rude, you're revealing something ugly about your own character and your fundamental failure to recognize the humanity and worth of other people." Sterling stood silently, absorbing criticism that was both painful and necessary. He had never been confronted so directly about his treatment of service workers, and he was beginning to understand that his behavior reflected poorly on his upbringing, his values, and his basic decency as a human being. "I want you to think about something," Elvis continued. "What if the circumstances of your life changed tomorrow? What if you lost your business, your wealth, your social status? What if you found yourself in a position where you had to take whatever work you could find to survive?" The hypothetical scenario made Sterling visibly uncomfortable, because it forced him to imagine himself in Dorothy's position, dependent on service work and subject to the kind of contemptuous treatment he had been dispensing to others. "Would you want to be treated the way you've been treating Mrs. Williams and other hotel staff?" Elvis asked. "Would you want your worth as a human being judged solely by your current job title and economic circumstances?" Sterling looked at Dorothy again, and this time he saw her not as a service function, but as a person whose dignity and resilience in the face of enormous challenges made his own complaints about business stress seem petty and self-indulgent. "No," Sterling said quietly, "I wouldn't want to be treated that way." "Then why?" Elvis asked simply. "Do you think it's acceptable to treat others that way?" The question cut to the heart of the matter with surgical precision. Sterling had no good answer because there was no good answer. His treatment of service workers had been based on nothing more than selfish privilege and moral laziness. "It's not acceptable," Sterling admitted. "I've been acting like someone I don't want to be." Elvis nodded with approval at Sterling's honest self-assessment, then turned back to Dorothy with obvious respect and admiration. "Mrs. Williams," Elvis said, "I want you to know that your profession, whether it was teaching literature or maintaining hotel rooms, doesn't define your worth as a person. Your character, your resilience, your compassion for others, your dedication to excellence in whatever you do, those things define your worth." Dorothy felt overwhelmed by Elvis's recognition of her dignity and value at a time when she had begun to doubt her own worth in a world that seemed to judge people primarily by their economic status and social position. "You've maintained your grace and professionalism despite facing challenges that would have broken many people," Elvis continued. "You've preserved your dignity even when others tried to take it away from you. That's the mark of someone with real strength and character." The validation meant more to Dorothy than she could express, not because it came from a celebrity, but because it came from someone who had taken the time to see her as a complete human being rather than just a function to be performed. Sterling, meanwhile, was experiencing a transformation in his understanding of what it meant to treat other people with appropriate respect and consideration. Elvis's defense of Dorothy had been more than just a correction of bad behavior. It had been a masterclass in recognizing and honoring the humanity of people regardless of their current circumstances. "Mr. Sterling," Elvis said, "I hope you'll think about what we've discussed here today. Not just about how you treat hotel staff, but about how you see other people in general. Everyone you encounter has a story, has struggles, has dreams and hopes and fears just like yours. Elvis's voice took on the tone of someone offering genuine guidance rather than criticism. The measure of a person's character isn't how much money they have or what kind of work they do. It's how they treat other people, especially people who can't do anything for them in return. Sterling nodded solemnly, understanding that Elvis was offering him an opportunity for genuine self-improvement and moral growth. "I understand," Sterling said, "and I want you both to know that I'm going to think seriously about everything you've said. I don't like the person I've been in this hotel, and I want to do better." Elvis smiled for the first time since entering the suite, clearly pleased that Sterling was taking the lesson seriously rather than simply enduring it until Elvis left. "That's all any of us can do," Elvis said. "Recognize our mistakes, learn from them, and commit to treating others better in the future." He turned back to Dorothy one final time. "Mrs. Williams, it's been an honor to meet you. Thank you for sharing your story with us, and thank you for the work you've done both as an educator and as someone who takes pride in serving others with professionalism and dignity." Dorothy felt a warmth and gratitude that she hadn't experienced in months. Elvis's recognition of her worth had reminded her that her current circumstances didn't erase her lifetime of contributions or diminish her value as a human being. "Thank you, Mr. Presley," Dorothy said with sincere emotion. "This conversation has meant more to me than you could know." Elvis left Sterling's suite with the satisfaction of knowing that he had used his influence to defend someone who couldn't defend herself and to teach a valuable lesson about human dignity and respect. But the impact of that morning's encounter would extend far beyond the immediate participants. Sterling spent the remainder of his stay at the hotel making deliberate efforts to treat service staff with courtesy and respect. He learned the names of housekeepers, waiters, and bellhops. He thanked people for their service and asked about their day. He tipped generously and spoke to service workers as human beings rather than as functions. The change in Sterling's behavior was so dramatic that hotel staff began talking about it among themselves. Dorothy found herself receiving respectful greetings from Sterling whenever their paths crossed, and she could see genuine remorse in his eyes along with what appeared to be a sincere commitment to treating others better. More importantly, Sterling took Elvis's lesson back to his business and personal life in Chicago. He began treating his own employees with greater respect and consideration. He made efforts to learn about their backgrounds and families. He implemented policies that recognized employee contributions and supported professional development. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it was genuine. Sterling had been forced to confront ugly truths about his character, and he had chosen to use that confrontation as an opportunity for moral growth rather than defensive resistance. Dorothy, meanwhile, found that Elvis's recognition of her dignity and worth had restored something in her that she had been losing during her 2 years at the hotel. She began to see her current work not as a diminishment of her former professional status, but as another way of serving others with skill and dedication. She also began to rebuild some of the confidence that had been eroded by months of being treated as invisible or inconvenient by hotel guests. Elvis's passionate defense of her humanity had reminded her that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or assumptions about her circumstances. She also began to rebuild some of the confidence that had been eroded by months of being treated as invisible or inconvenient by hotel guests. Elvis's passionate defense of her humanity had reminded her that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or assumptions about her circumstances. 6 months after their encounter, Dorothy received an unexpected visit from Elvis, who had come to ask if she would be interested in tutoring his daughter Lisa Marie in literature and writing. He explained that he had been impressed by Dorothy's obvious love of teaching and her sophisticated understanding of how literature could inspire young people. Dorothy accepted the tutoring position, which provided additional income and, more importantly, an opportunity to return to educational work that had always been her true calling. Working with Lisa Marie reminded Dorothy of why she had become a teacher in the first place and helped her maintain connection to the profession she loved. The story of Elvis's defense of Dorothy Williams became legendary among hotel staff, not just at the Las Vegas International Hotel but throughout the hospitality industry, as word spread about Elvis's passionate advocacy for service worker dignity. The encounter became a model for how people with influence and platform could use their status to defend those who couldn't defend themselves and to challenge attitudes and behaviors that diminished human dignity. Hotel management, inspired by Elvis's example, implemented new policies designed to ensure that all guests treated staff with appropriate respect. They also created programs to recognize and celebrate the backgrounds and contributions of service workers, helping guests understand that the people who served them had complex lives and valuable experiences beyond their current job functions. The legacy of that morning's conversation extended far beyond its immediate participants. It became a reminder that every interaction between human beings is an opportunity to either honor or diminish each other's dignity, and that those with privilege and influence have special responsibilities to defend the humanity of those who might not be able to defend themselves. Dorothy Williams continued working at the hotel for another year before transitioning to full-time tutoring and eventually returning to formal classroom teaching. She never forgot Elvis's passionate defense of her worth, and she made sure to share the story with her students as an example of how one person's courage in standing up for others could create positive change that extended far beyond the original moment. The encounter between Elvis, Dorothy, and Richard Sterling became a powerful reminder that respect isn't something that should be rationed based on social status or economic position. It's something that should be extended to every human being as a basic acknowledgement of their inherent worth and dignity. Years later, when Dorothy was interviewed about that transformative morning at the Las Vegas International Hotel, she reflected on how Elvis's intervention had changed not just her own sense of self-worth, but her understanding of how people with privilege and influence could choose to use their platform for positive change. Elvis didn't have to get involved, Dorothy said during the interview. He could have walked past that door and minded his own business like most people would have done. But he chose to step in and defend someone who couldn't defend herself. That choice made all the difference. The story spread throughout Las Vegas and beyond, becoming a legendary example of how one person's courage in standing up for human dignity could create ripple effects that lasted for decades. It inspired other celebrities and influential people to be more conscious of how service workers were treated in their presence, and it encouraged ordinary people to speak up when they witnessed disrespectful behavior toward others. Hotel training programs began incorporating the story as an example of how to create environments where all people, regardless of their job function, were treated with appropriate respect and consideration. The hospitality industry as a whole began to recognize that truly exceptional service meant not just serving guests well, but creating workplace cultures where service providers could maintain their dignity while doing their jobs. Dorothy's story also became a powerful illustration of how quickly circumstances could change anyone's life situation, and how important it was to treat others with kindness and respect regardless of their current position. Her transition from respected educator to hotel housekeeper demonstrated that job titles were temporary and circumstantial, while character and human worth remained constant. The tutoring work with Lisa Marie Presley that grew out of that morning's encounter eventually led Dorothy back to full-time teaching, where she spent her final professional years sharing not just literature and writing skills but lessons about human dignity, empathy, and the importance of treating all people with respect regardless of their circumstances. Sterling, for his part, became a different kind of businessman and a different kind of person. The lesson Elvis had taught him about recognizing the humanity in service workers extended to how he treated employees, business partners, and strangers he encountered in his daily life. He often credited that morning at the Las Vegas International Hotel as a turning point that made him not just more successful in business but more fulfilled as a human being. The Las Vegas International Hotel itself became known as a place where service workers were treated with exceptional respect, and where guests were expected to maintain high standards of courtesy toward all staff members. The culture that developed from Elvis's example attracted both employees who took pride in their work and guests who appreciated being part of an environment that honored human dignity above social hierarchy. Elvis's passionate defense of Dorothy Williams on that October morning in 1974 demonstrated that true leadership isn't just about entertaining audiences or achieving professional success. It's about using whatever influence you have to defend those who need defending, to challenge attitudes and behaviors that diminish human worth, and to create positive change that extends far beyond your own immediate interests. The legacy of that conversation continues to inspire people today who face the choice between remaining silent when they witness disrespect or finding the courage to speak up for human dignity. It serves as a reminder that every person has the power to make a difference by choosing to see and honor the humanity in everyone they encounter, regardless of circumstances or social position. In a world that often measures people's worth by their economic status or professional achievements, the story of Elvis, Dorothy, and Richard Sterling offers a different measure of human value. The capacity to treat others with kindness, respect, and recognition of their inherent dignity as fellow human beings, navigating the challenges and opportunities of life with whatever grace and strength they can muster. That morning at the Las Vegas International Hotel proved that respect isn't a luxury that only some people deserve. It's a basic human right that should be extended to everyone, and defending that right for others is one of the most important things any of us can do with whatever influence and platform we have in this world. The documentary about Dorothy Williams and her encounter with Elvis was produced in 1989, 15 years after that transformative morning. The film featured extensive interviews with all three participants and became a powerful educational tool used in hospitality training programs, business ethics courses, and community workshops about workplace dignity and respect. Dorothy, by then back to full-time teaching, spoke movingly about how Elvis's intervention had restored not just her sense of self-worth, but her faith in the possibility that people with privilege would use their influence to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. I had begun to believe that my worth as a person was determined by how others saw my current circumstances, Dorothy reflected in the documentary. Elvis reminded me that my value came from my character, my resilience, and my contributions to others' lives, not from my job title or economic status. Sterling, who had become a successful advocate for worker dignity in his own business practices, spoke about the lasting impact of Elvis's lesson on his personal and professional life. That morning forced me to confront the ugliest aspects of my character, Sterling admitted. Elvis showed me that true success isn't measured by how much power you have over others, but by how you use whatever influence you have to lift others up rather than tear them down. The hotel industry adopted new standards for guest behavior towards service staff, with many establishments implementing policies that required respectful treatment of all employees as a condition of service. The Elvis standard became shorthand for creating workplace environments where human dignity was protected regardless of job function or social hierarchy. Dorothy's story inspired countless service workers who had experienced similar dismissive treatment to maintain their dignity and self-respect, despite others' failure to recognize their worth. Her example demonstrated that circumstances might force people into situations they hadn't chosen, but that inner strength and character remained constant regardless of external conditions. The annual Dignity in Service Awards ceremony, established by the hospitality industry in 1985, honored both service workers who maintained exceptional professionalism despite challenging circumstances and customers who demonstrated outstanding respect for service providers. The awards were inspired by Dorothy's grace under pressure and Elvis's passionate defense of worker dignity. Educational institutions began incorporating Dorothy's story into curricula about career transitions, resilience in the face of adversity, and the importance of treating all people with respect regardless of their current circumstances. Her experience became a case study in how quickly life situations could change and how important it was to maintain empathy for others facing difficult transitions. Sterling's transformation influenced business leadership programs that emphasized the connection between employee treatment and organizational success. His experience demonstrated that leaders who created respectful, dignified work environments achieved better results than those who relied on hierarchy and intimidation to motivate performance. The story continued to resonate with new generations of workers and leaders who faced choices about how to treat others in professional environments. It served as a reminder that every interaction was an opportunity to either honor or diminish someone else's humanity, and that choosing to honor others' dignity ultimately created more positive outcomes for everyone involved. Today, more than 50 years after that October morning in Las Vegas, The story of Elvis, Dorothy, and Richard Sterling remains a powerful example of how individual actions can create lasting positive change. It demonstrates that standing up for others' dignity requires courage, but that such courage can transform not just the immediate situation but entire cultures and communities. The legacy of that conversation continues in every workplace where leaders choose to treat employees with respect, in every service interaction where customers recognize the humanity of those who serve them, and in every moment when someone with privilege uses their influence to defend those who need defending. Dorothy Williams taught literature for another 12 years after returning to the classroom, retiring at age 70 with the satisfaction of knowing that her life had made a meaningful difference, not just through her formal teaching, but through her example of maintaining dignity and grace in the face of enormous challenges. Richard Sterling built his real estate empire into one of the most employee-friendly companies in Chicago, known for its respectful workplace culture and commitment to recognizing the worth and contributions of all team members regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Elvis Presley continued using his platform to defend human dignity and challenge prejudice until his death in 1977, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond entertainment to encompass genuine advocacy for treating all people with the respect and consideration they deserved as fellow human beings. The morning when Elvis heard Sterling dismiss Dorothy as just a cleaning lady and chose to intervene became a defining moment that proved one person's courage in standing up for others could create positive change that lasted for generations. It remains an inspiration for anyone who faces the choice between remaining silent in the face of injustice or finding the strength to speak up for human dignity and respect. In a world where social media and modern technology have created new ways for people to treat others with dismissive cruelty, the story of Elvis defending Dorothy's dignity serves as a timeless reminder that our humanity is measured not by our circumstances or achievements, but by how we choose to treat others, especially those who cannot defend themselves. The encounter at the Las Vegas International Hotel proved that respect, dignity, and basic human decency are not luxuries to be rationed based on social status or economic position. They are fundamental rights that belong to everyone, and protecting those rights for others is one of the most important responsibilities that comes with whatever privilege and influence we might have in this world.